August 23rd, 1973. A day that changed the psychological makeup of psychiatrists and how we diagnose things forever took place. On this particular day, one convict walked across the street, an escaped convict, into a bank and decided to hold this bank up for an amount of $700,000. And in the midst of this standoff with the police and the people inside the bank, he held them hostage right there in that bank. And during that period of time, these individuals were afraid for their life as he held a gun to them. But at the same time, he befriended them and became their protector against the police, their protector against what could happen. And one person began to thank the person because he said if something happened, he would only shoot them in the leg so as not to really hurt them. And she thanked him for that, as it seemed as though he had compassion. And at one point in time, this individual ended up giving one of the bullets to a person as a keepsake of what was taking place. This event took place in Stockholm, Sweden. It is famously known as the Stockholm Syndrome at this point in time. My name is Trent Jenkins, and thanks for joining us for today's Daily Dose. The Stockholm Syndrome ultimately came about for psychologists as they reviewed what took place, because ultimately those that were held captive in this bank decided not to end up testifying against their captor. You see, he had befriended them so much so that they would not leave the vault until they could guarantee that they were not going to shoot the person that held them hostage. This Stockholm Syndrome ultimately looks at the element where we end up developing an element for ourselves to be able to cope with the tragedy, to cope with the incredible, awful circumstances that we're in. And so we psychologically befriend the thing that is actually holding us back. As we take a look at today's passage, and this week we're talking about freedom, the freedom that we get from Christ. I often wonder, though, why it is that we don't live our lives in freedom when we know as Christians Christ has set us free. If he who has set you free is free indeed, then why don't I feel like I'm free? Anybody feel like that? Or it just feels like, man, I know I ended up asking forgiveness. I know Christ has forgiven me, but I just feel overwhelmed and overloaded. I don't feel free in the least bit. I think somewhat of this psychological makeup makes sense here, where we actually end up cozying up to the sin in our lives, and it becomes an element of comfort for us. It becomes what we know, and if that's what we know, we don't like going to the unknown, of the unfamiliar, the uncomfortable. To break past this barrier to live a different life means I have to give up the life I once knew, but the life I once knew is what's familiar and comfortable. And so just like those that are held hostage in this bank, we in our own lives and our spirits are held hostage to what we once knew. We look today in Romans 8. I love this passage, and starting at verse 2, because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit who gives life set you free from the law of sin and death. Jumping down to verse 5, those who live according to the flesh have their mind set on what the flesh desires. But those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their mind set on what the Spirit desires. The mind governed by the flesh cannot please God. But the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. The mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those who remain in the flesh cannot please God. You see, there's this element where Christ has set us free. So how do we live it out? Well, it means we actually have to take a step past this level of comfort and into the promise that God has given to you and to me. And so today I challenge you, as we look at this passage, that Christ has set us free. It means that we have to change our mindset. Romans 12, 1 and 2, right? That we have to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And today I challenge you, be renewed by your mind. Let the Spirit take control and say, there might be some areas that are uncomfortable for me, but I'm going to live it out in faith because He set me free. And I want to walk in faith in the promises that God has given me. Thanks so much for joining us for today's Daily Dose.